Jim Siegler here for BrainWaves. Before we get started, a brief disclaimer. I would like to warn any listeners out there with sensitive ears that today's episode will feature discussions about real neurologic disorders and how they may appear similar to our cultural understanding of zombies. This doesn't mean that if you have spinocerebellar ataxia or frontotemporal dementia, for example, that you're a zombie. So if it offends you that we make such comparisons, then we apologize. And you should probably turn off the show and listen to something more cheerful than a show about zombies. I'll give you a minute to do that now while we play this message from one of our sponsors.
This episode of BrainWaves and the following message are brought to you by Audible, home to nearly 200,000 ad-free audiobooks. This week, I'm recommending World War Z, an oral history of the zombie war, written and narrated by Max Brooks. If you like the movie, you'll love the book. And listening to it on Audible will take you through the full story in only 6 hours. So, get your free copy by signing up for a free month on audibletrial.com/brainwaves. Or just wait for the zombie apocalypse to happen and don't prepare yourself. That works too.
This week, we're going to try to answer one question.
Are zombies real?
Sorry, that was Erika. Here's the question.
Is there any disease states out there that are comparable to zombie-ism?
I bet you never thought that we'd do an episode about zombies. Well, we did. And for those of you who are sticking with the show this week, I think you're going to love it. But I'm sad to say it was not my idea to feature this topic on a BrainWaves episode. It just so happens that one of our previous correspondents on the show happens to be a veteran when it comes to zombie lore and the neurology behind zombies. And when it comes to lecturing on this topic, he makes it sound like it's a reasonable educational experience for students and the residents he works with.
I wanted to make it originally like a 3-lecture series, one on neuroanatomy in the brain, so going over the lesions in the central nervous system, one on the public health, disaster preparedness, and then one on the cultural aspect and more like toxidromes and things like that. But I've been using this as a lecture once a year, right around Halloween, when people get excited about this type of stuff.
Dr. Brian Hanrahan is a senior neurology resident at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and he's given a lecture on zombies and neurology for the past 5 years now to his colleagues.
It was really fun. I did this as a medical student, got credit for it actually, and I gave this talk as a 4th year. And then, as I've continued my training, it's kind of matured a little bit to be a little more higher level of education. I gave it to the internal medicine residents last year, and I plan on trying to do that maybe sometime in the spring. But yeah, people pay attention. It's cool to take a very pop culture topic and make it so it's educational.
Yeah, I mean, what was the instigator? What was the impetus that drove you to this talk?
I mean, in all honesty, I think it started when I was in college, actually even going back farther to high school, when I watched the first Dawn of the Dead movie that came out, I think, in 2004. And I just remember watching that and wondering, what kind of virus could cause this? What kind of abnormalities in the brain can cause this? And obviously, as a high school student, you couldn't really answer those questions. But as I continued my training, I kind of realized, I can actually use what I'm being educated on to answer these questions. And then in my 4th year of medical school, I thought this was a really cool topic to teach not only neuroanatomy, but also practice some public health and virology and other kind of infectious stuff.
Nice. Well, I think it's a fantastic idea, and it does not surprise me that so many people are interested in it. And there are so many other kind of cultural concepts that have probably been born out of some medical underpinning, some sort of medical background, like vampirism and, werewolves. I'm sure that there's some sort of medical historical element to why people thought, I think that there are vampires, or I think that there are these other weird people out there, or could be zombies.
Yeah, exactly. I think, if you looked back at the historical references of where the origins of the term zombie comes from, it's primarily from Haitian folklore, where people were put to death by a necromancer and then brought back to life, and they became slaves and that were in this kind of zombie form. And it became kind of aware in the United States that this was going on in the early 1900s But it wasn't until like the 1980s someone actually tried to figure out how zombification was happening in these cultures. There was a famous ethnobotanist named Wade Davis, and he tried to analyze the concoction that these sorcerers were using to put these people in this kind of dead-like state and reanimating them, and outlined that there was probably a concoction of tetrodotoxin as well as another thing called datura. So we get taught about tetrodotoxin in medical school. This is a compound that's found in a number of animals, most commonly known as the one in pufferfish, that will act on the sodium channels, preferentially in the central nervous system, while largely sparing the cardiac and peripheral nervous system. Additionally, the tetroda flowering plant that was also believed to be in this concoction had a lot of anticholinergic effects, which could probably lead to some type of anticholinergic delirium. And that's kind of the origins of zombies and zombie-ism. However, it kind of went through a pop culture evolution, starting early with George Romero's movie Night of the Living Dead. However, over the next, most recent last few decades, there's been a dramatic explosion in the interest in zombies, with blockbuster movies like Dawn of the Dead, World War Z, as well as popular TV shows like The Walking Dead.
You can hear it! Some of you saw it. They got back here. Half of them. Still enough to surround us 20 deep.
So with this kind of new renowned interest in this, like you were talking about with, zombies and vampires and werewolves, certain physicians took real interest in this and tried to make a explanation how this can happen in real life.
Look, I know you're scared. You haven't seen anything like this.
And there are a lot of other pretty decent explanations to zombieism in neurology, in addition to what Brian already mentioned regarding the tetrodotoxin anticholinergic concoction that was prepared by the Haitian necromancers in the late 19th century. And you can find some of these on a PubMed search.
Yeah, so there's been about 145 articles that have zombie in their subject line. And I think that has actually increased pretty regularly and more than just linearly since I started presenting and talking on this subject.
If we group it by year, in 2000 there was only one article with a zombie in the subject. By 2005, 2 articles. 2008, 4 articles. 7 papers in 2009, 10 in 2013, 12 in 2014, and 17 in this year already. Considering all the available scientific, peer-reviewed literature on zombies, more than half of these publications emerged in the last 3 years alone.
Some of the talks are related to disaster preparedness, which we've talked about before. Others kind of are related to parasites and host behavior manipulation. The common one that we learned about growing up in medical school and beyond is Toxoplasma gondii. Normally, this parasite has a natural life cycle between their definitive host in cats and their intermediate hosts, the rodents. And rodents, when they're infected with this parasite, they no longer avoid areas that have high likelihood of having cats, which increases their chance of completing their life cycle.
Meaning the mice would die. And there are plenty of other examples of parasitic manipulation of host behaviors, some of which sound pretty terrifying.
So the cordyceps fungi is a very species-specific fungus that interacts with ants. And when the specific cordyceps fungi interacts with a specific ant, it will lead to them to having very irregular behavior. What they will actually do is they will leave their colony, climb up to the perfect place where this fungi can grow on a piece of vegetation, and the ant will lock its jaw onto that vegetation. Now the ant, since it's stuck there, will actually die, and then the fungal hyphae will actually grow out of the ant's exoskeleton in a location perfect for its growth. So those are some of the things that you can find when you look up zombieism on PubMed. But the more impressive things that have been published in the last year or so have been related to toxidromes that present with zombie-like behavior. There was a very good article that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine that outlined a zombie outbreak related to a synthetic cannabinoid. The title of this cannabinoid was labeled AK-47 24 karat gold.
Some of you probably remember this paper. 18 patients from Brooklyn were evaluated for bizarre behaviors, and they appeared zombie-like.
Slow to respond, having a blank stare, being lethargic.
They were groaning, had slow mechanical movements, and some behaviors you might actually see in advanced Parkinsonism, or that you'd see in zombies.
Without having any focal neurologic findings or vital abnormalities.
And if the New England Journal published a paper on a zombie outbreak, then we can definitely talk about it on a podcast.
So liquid chromatography was performed on the inhaled cannabinoid that was labeled AK-47 24 karat gold, and it revealed a product called amb-fubinaca, which is known to be about 85 times more potent than normal THC, and 50 times as potent as the compound that was found in early outbreaks of K2 synthetic cannabinoid products.
I mean, that sounds terribly potent.
Very much so. And I think what was one of the interesting things about this compound, too, compared to other synthetic cannabinoids, this one didn't have the concurrent side effects in their vital signs. So they didn't have the accompanied tachycardia, arrhythmia, hyperthermia, or acute kidney injury.
The compound that was isolated from these 18 patients was a structural analog to a chemical produced by Pfizer called amb-fubinaca. In 2014, the AMB formulation was isolated from several intoxicated patients in Louisiana, and it was linked to a drug affectionately known as Trainwreck 2.
Oh, hey, listen, try this. I told my weed guy to step it up, and he gave me that.
What is it?
It's called Mind. It's actually pretty mellow.
It doesn't sound very mellow.
Well, he only had 3 other batches. Gorilla Panic, They're Coming, and something called This Is Permanent. Go on, spark it up.
It's really tough because a lot of these compounds actually don't really have the proper testing for, and that's why you have to do the liquid chromatography to find. And the difficult thing was actually when they did liquid chromatography of the samples collected from patients, none of them had this compound because it's broken down. So they did find one of its derivatives in their system that suggested they did inhale this agent. So unfortunately, a lot of these patients that have kind of these very unusual responses to these synthetic drugs, it's really difficult to be able to analyze for because you're not exactly sure what you're looking for in the first place.
And so the authors of this New England Journal paper suggested that their behaviors were zombie-like because they were encephalopathic and groaning and moving slowly?
Exactly.
Did they have the same ravenous appetite that you see in patients who are stoned?
So they did not talk about that part in their journal. It seems like they may have been too encephalopathic to really have what you would call, scientifically as the munchies.
And in addition to the more scientifically sound explanations behind zombie-ism, several scientists and neurologists have taken a fair bit of creative license to describe zombie neuroscience. But we'll get into that in a minute after this short break.
This BrainWaves episode is supported in part by Sunbasket. When the zombie apocalypse comes and the grocery stores are emptied out, where will you get your food from? Sunbasket offers a wide variety of meal options for every cuisine, from paleo-friendly to gluten-free. And for less than $10 per plate, it can fit into nearly everyone's budget. Go to brainwaves.me to learn more and get $35 off your first order.
One of my favorite books that kind of cover this is one by Dr. Stephen Schultzman, a psychologist from Harvard Medical School, who wrote a book about 6 years ago called The Zombie Autopsies, where he covered a disease which he termed as ataxic neurodegenerative satiety deficiency syndrome, or ANSD.
This book is not unlike the story presented in the 2007 film I Am Legend, based on the 1954 novel by Richard Matheson. In both the film I Am Legend and the book Zombie Autopsies, the protagonist has committed his life to the study of these undead creatures. In Zombie Autopsies, Dr. Stanley Bloom, who was actually infected by the zombie virus, studies zombies as if they were patients suffering from a neurologic disease, and he stratifies them based on the severity of their symptoms.
Progression from being moderately affected with some extreme hunger and a coexisting fever to progressive cognitive decline, increasing hunger, impaired lucidity, changes in balance, and then progressing to frequent falls and aggressive behavior. And then the fourth stage where people are no longer classified as humans, where they're profoundly hyperaggressive, have global aphasia, and loss of complete awareness.
And while this may currently be a fictional neurologic disorder, ataxic neurodegenerative satiety deficiency syndrome, there is some real science to back up how such a disorder may occur. If A and SD were real, or if it could become real, it would be the result of a destructive process rather than an activating one. And just like any other condition in neurology, the goal is to localize the lesion.
There's about 6 or so lesions that you would see in the central nervous system that could present similarly to a patient with ataxic neurodegenerative satiety deficiency, or zombie-ism.
Again, we mean no offense by making these comparisons. They are just observations.
Usually people like to think that they have some frontal lobe dysfunction that would be comparable to patients that have frontal temporal dementia. There is some comparable semiology to these two diseases, including disinhibition, apathy, loss of emotional recognition, compulsive behavior, hyperorality, and dietary changes. A lot of people think that people with zombie-ism have also a cerebellar dysfunction that you could see maybe in like spinal cerebellar ataxia, where you would have this wide base, unsteady gait with lateral veering and exaggerated difficulty with turns. And this would be very different than the fast-paced variant zombies that you would see in certain movies like the movie World War Z, 28 Days Later, as opposed to the slow-moving zombies that you'd see more classically in The Night of the Living Dead and the book World War Z. There's probably also some anterograde amnesia that would be present in these patients that would be due to bilateral hippocampal dysfunction, where there'd be problems with declarative memory. So they wouldn't be able to remember, following someone for a long period of time. They would get distracted and do something else. And we also know that the hippocampus has a very large role in spatial navigation. That's why zombies look like they're wandering around.
Another example of a neurologic disorder similar to zombie-ism that Brian refers to in his talks, and this one is a little more of a stretch, is the Billen syndrome, a bilateral parietal lobe disorder characterized by the triad of optic ataxia, oculomotor apraxia, and simultagnosia. And in particular, the simultagnosia element may be the most relevant here for zombies.
There's been some fictional examples of zombies being distracted by fireworks or fire or something else very specific in their surroundings that would allow others in the periphery to escape.
And have you ever tried to talk to a zombie? That's an easy lesion to localize.
It would be safe to assume that all zombies would have damage to their Wernicke's and Broca's area in their dominant hemisphere. And then lastly, there's probably some damage to their pain pathways, probably more specifically to their spinal reticular pathway as opposed to the spinal thalamic one, because the spinal reticular pathway really has more of a involvement of the arousal aspects of pain or the emotional relation to pain, as opposed to the spinal thalamic pathway, which is more related to the discriminative aspects of it.
But you have to wonder, what kind of disease would account for this type of multifocal destructive process? And Brian gets asked this a lot from his peers.
So people usually ask, what do you think is the best example of a vector out there that would be a good launching point for this type of disease? My favorite one is probably the rabies virus, being that it is transferred primarily through bites and saliva. It would be the perfect candidate for the type of spreading that would occur commonly in all the fictional stories with zombie-ism. So potentially a very highly virulent lysovirus, which is the class of rabies.
Not to mention other infectious particles like prions, which can cause a rapidly progressive dementia, ataxic gait, and other features that are similar to what you might see in a zombie movie. And then there are toxicities like the ones that we mentioned before. One toxicity that we haven't mentioned, like K2 and other synthetic cannabinoids, is that seen in bath salt abuse.
Being blamed for a gruesome scene in Miami. This is a naked man. He was shot dead on Saturday by police because he was gnawing off another man's face. Obviously, the
assailant from this episode, Rudy Eugene, was found snarling. He was not following commands. He was acting with extreme disinhibition and aggression. It's no wonder that he was later called the Miami Zombie.
31-year-old Rudy Eugene was described to be in a zombie-like state when he was caught by police. The victim was 65 years old, truly horrific. Apparently all that's left is his goatee. His eyeballs were gone, his face. It is unbelievable.
I guess going back to your original plan when you started giving these talks to your med school, you staged it in 3 ways. The second way was discussing zombie-ism from a public health perspective. And I was extremely surprised to find that the American Red Cross and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention both provide zombie action plans on their websites. Can you kind of summarize their recommendations and why did they ever come up with them?
Yeah, so I think that the American Red Cross and the CDC saw an opportunity to reach out to a very young community that normally wouldn't have had any interest in disaster preparedness. And that's kind of how they spun this part of their care. In 2011, the CDC launched this kind of zombie preparedness campaign where a lot of people kind of reached out to them and said, we want to actually have this for our communities, for our kids. So a lot of material was created for this reason. And then in 2013, the American Red Cross did the same thing where they helped kind of get people aware and prepare for disasters by creating what's called a go bag, which is a bag that contains all the necessities in case one needs to perform a hasty evacuation from wherever they're living.
I think that a lot of that does make sense, and I think it's not unwise to plan for emergency evacuations like this, especially in light of recent events that we've seen in Central and South America and as a result of these recent hurricanes.
Absolutely.
How worried do you think that people should be? How scared do you think that people should be that something like a zombie apocalypse or a massive outbreak could occur?
I think the likelihood of a zombie outbreak occurring in our lifetimes is very low.
Probably worth mentioning here is that neither myself nor Brian are epidemiologists or virologists. We don't work for the CDC, and we really have zero credibility when it comes to predicting the future of a major outbreak. We both just happen to like zombie movies.
Although I think we should always be prepared. But the second thing you said for a severe outbreak, I think that is much, much more likely to occur at some point. We've already seen outbreaks of H1N1 and swine flu and
Zika. And
exactly, things that could become easily endemic with how global every culture has become. That, is something that really we should be aware of.
Well, I must say, I think that you're the first zombie expert that I've ever spoken with. I appreciate you coming onto the show and talking to us about zombies for the Halloween episode.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I'd love to do it again sometime.
That wraps it up for our zombie episode special this week. Thanks again to Dr. Brian Hanrahan for giving us some pretty interesting insight into how neurologic disorders may have unknowingly impacted pop culture and the notion of zombies. I guess, in some way, they are real, just not exactly what you see in the movies. There are heritable and acquired disorders that are characterized by slow movements and groaning, in particular the symptoms observed by ultra-potent synthetic cannabinoids. There are also infectious causes of delirium and agitation or aggression, like what we see in the rabies virus and in some prions. Disinhibited behaviors are seen across the spectrum of neurologic disease, but variants of frontotemporal dementia are one great example. And in light of each of these similarities to zombie-ism, it makes you think that zombie-ism exists along a spectrum. And one day, there may be a zombie apocalypse where some pandemic virus or pathogen evolves, like what we've seen in history with the bubonic plague of the Middle Ages, or Spanish influenza in the early 20th century. And we should prepare ourselves for that. It sounds crazy, but we should be ready for some sort of major outbreak, whether you call it a zombie apocalypse or not. I mean, after all, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the American Red Cross already have action plans. Could it be so crazy that you should too? This week's episode of the BrainWaves podcast was produced by me, Jim Siegler. Our zombie expert was Dr. Brian Hanrahan. Our zombie music was courtesy of Andrew Sacco, Ars Sonor, and Little Glass Men. Our studio zombie was Erika Mejia. For more information on zombie preparedness and what the US government agencies have to say about it, please check out our blog at brainwaves.me. If you liked our zombie show, we'd love to hear about it. You can send us feedback at bweditorialboard@gmail.com or rate us on iTunes. We can definitely use more stars. I'm Jim Siegler, and I'll talk at you next week.